So how surprised were you, first of all, to see the speed racing culture in Ramallah?
I was completely surprised. The first time that I was asked, a friend asked if I wanted to go to a race, I was like, where can this race even happen? Considering all the roadblocks, and they just don't have access to space. So we went to Bethlehem, and on top of this hill, there was this huge tarmac that used to be Arafat's helicopter landing pad. And when I got up there, it was just like this amazing sort of chaotic scene, with like tons of people watching, the cars whipping around and all this music playing. And sort of in the middle of that, there were these women throwing on their helmets. And it was one of the most surprising things I had ever seen.
Yeah, what did you think when you first saw the women participating as well?
Yeah, I was blown away. Like it wasn't something I was expecting. And I just went up and started talking to them right then and there. And they were, really receptive, really nice. And that's how it started.
So outsiders have stereotypes about women in the Arab world, but is it surprising to people in the region that women are racing cars?
Definitely. Like it's, and the Speed Sisters aren't the first women racers. There's there's other women racers from around the Middle East, from Iran and from Jordan and Lebanon and Kuwait. But the Speed Sisters are sort of the first all-female team. And yeah, when Palestinians and when other Arabs hear about it, they're just as shocked as anyone else.
How did they come together as a team?
It was sort of organically, really. I think there was a bunch of them, like 3 or 4 of them that had been racing sort of independently. And then they had they had some trainers, these women that came, these 2 race car drivers from the UK that came and gave them sort of lessons, like a workshop. And then they invited any woman, like anyone that wanted to come. And there was quite a bit of interest. And the ones that sort of kept coming just sort of called themselves the Speed Sisters and continued racing.
What did they tell you that they love about racing?
Well, I think for them across the board is a sense of freedom. Like when I think about myself getting a driver's license at 16, and the independence and the freedom that I felt now, like living under, a foreign occupation where so much of your life is limited and dictated by somebody else. When you're behind the wheel of a car where you can actually make those decisions of where you want to go, it's really liberating for them. And then you put the speed and the competition on top of that. It's just a sense of freedom for them.
So they may be all women and all part of one team, but there's some very distinct personalities.
Yeah, definitely.
Can you talk about the biggest differences that you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the nice thing about the Speed Sisters is each one of them they are very distinct personalities, but they are all very relatable. I think that, the audiences will sort of find themselves in each one of them. You have like Betty, who's like, we always say that she's like a Lebanese pop star. She's very glamorous and nails always done and always looks perfect, right? And then you have Noor, who's kind of a tomboy and who, really loves sports, but, just can't figure out, can't memorize the map and just kind of can't figure out her way in life as well as on the track. And you have Mara, that's like the girl next door that grew up sort of on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. Her father comes from a refugee camp and they live in Jenin. Mm-hmm. And she's, she just wants to, show the world that there's, a woman named Mara Zahelka from Jenin who's competing, and then Maysoon, who's a little bit older and is trying to make those decisions about, does she get married? Does she wait for the right guy? These kinds of things. So they're all, I think that they're all very relatable characters in a very unusual setting.
Mara is one of the best racers.
Yes.
And she says something quite striking in the documentary. She says, "What are we supposed to do? Stop living? When that happens, the occupation wins." What do you think she meant by that?
Well, I think for Palestinians, like that they're living there, they're not dying there, and they're living, and for them, living their life despite the occupation is a form of resistance for them. So if they can, have access to hobbies and passions and and live their life as much on their own terms as they possibly can, that's sort of a form of resistance. It don't allow themselves to be victims to the occupation. And I think that's what she means. And so for them, racing cars is very much a sense of resistance in a way. They're able to do what it is that they want to do despite the occupation.
Also striking about Mara's story is how supportive her father is. He's one of basically her biggest fan. How much support do female drivers get from the men in their lives, generally speaking?
Well, a lot of support, definitely. They wouldn't be able to do it without the support of their families. And I think that's very much like race car drivers anywhere around the world. It's a very expensive sport, and it's a very particular type of person that can afford to even do it. But I think in the case of the Speed Sisters, like what I found so amazing is that, obviously the film is going to break stereotypes when it comes to women, but I think it goes a long way to break stereotypes when it comes to Arab men, because you have these men that are so supportive. You have, Mara's father, who's like, financially and emotionally supports her. But you had, the head of the federation who created a space for these women to race in the first place. And you have all of the male racers that are super supportive and helpful and encouraging. So I think that was like an element of the film that I wasn't necessarily expecting when I first set out to make it, but was really pleasantly surprised when it
I have to admit,
out.
it surprised me when I watched it. Did it surprise you when you were making the film?
Yeah, I think it did. I kept trying to find where that tension was about, the resistance, especially with men, and it just wasn't there. And all of a sudden I kind of, at some point went, wait, the story is the fact that these guys are all really awesome and they're really supportive. And that's really a great thing.
One tension that is there is that despite the fact that these Speed Sisters are heroes in their racing world, at home there are still family pressures to get married, to fit into other female traditional roles. How did you find them navigating those two worlds?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess they navigate it as in how women navigate it here. There's not really a lot of difference between that. They push where they can push. They make concessions where they have to make concessions. I think the thing with the Speed Sisters are that they were very proud and really loved the society that they lived in. And so they didn't want to sort of break tradition too much. They wanted to push the boundaries without actually, going too far outside. So it was kind of a balancing act that they had to play. But I think ultimately what they have been able to do is they have been able to sort of bring society along with them,
That is very relatable. The kind of desire to not break away from tradition and from culture, but to continue to belong to it, but to change it.
Right, exactly.
From within.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely what they set out to do, what they're still doing.
Are many of them still racing?
Noor is racing in Dubai. She's living in Dubai now, and she does this like high-speed drift racing. And she's the only woman in the Middle East that does this. It's really crazy. She's also teaching skydiving, so that's that's totally her personality. Maysoon got married, and she's living in Jordan with her husband, and they race together in sort of rally drives where she's like the co-pilot. So they do that together. And then Mara, Mona, and Betty are still in the West Bank, and they're trying to race, but the political situation there has been quite tense, and so there hasn't been a lot of races over the last year. So I think they're quite frustrated, but they're still working on their cars and preparing for the next one.
So this film has been an audience favorite at festivals in the West. How conscious were you of giving outsiders a more complicated picture of life in the West Bank?
Very conscious. I think for me, I grew up, I'm from Grand Prairie, Alberta. I'll just say that right now so that everyone back home has a little shout out. But I think for me, growing up in Grand Prairie, I came from a very Canadian household, but my grandparents came from Lebanon, so we had quite an Arab influence. And what I saw sort of growing up, and especially after 9/11, is there was such a disconnect from my experience growing up in this Lebanese culture to what I was seeing on TV. On news and as well movies and these sort of things. And I just thought there was I just wanted to be able to tell the story of my experience in the Middle East and my experience with sort of a Middle Eastern background. And when I saw this, when I came across the Speed Sisters, I just thought that was a really amazing example to show the life and the interaction and the humor and the relationships between people, opposed to it just being about war and sort of. Yeah.
Is that moment what got you into storytelling?
Yeah,
September 11th?
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. that was definitely a point where I had to, sort of confront the fact that I had this Arab background that I wanted to know more about. Is because there was a lot of pushback towards Arabs and Muslims at that time, and my family was, that definitely was the brunt of that as well, and it was quite a confusing time. But I think from that, there was definitely a desire to be able to tell those types of stories.
So tell me about your first forays then into storytelling. What those look like for you?
Well, it was actually all in the West Bank. I had moved to the West Bank with an organization out of Vancouver that did film camps with Israeli, Palestinian, and Canadian youth, and that sort of got me to the West Bank. And then when I was in the West Bank, I sort of took that storytelling to the next level.
And the music in the film is pretty striking.
Yeah, the music's awesome. I love the music.
Yeah, where did you source that from?
It was really important for me to also highlight other unexpected things about the Middle East. And the Middle East right now has a really interesting independent music scene. And so I wanted to sort of draw from that. So a lot of the artists I knew personally. There were some that I found on a website called MideastTunes.com.
Okay.
And there's one, and I want to give a shout out to her too. It's a Toronto Palestinian artist by the name of Myrna, whose song I came across online and then contacted her. And within 20 minutes, we were on the phone talking. And her song is highlighted on the trailer. It's not in the film, but it's in the trailer.
So given your experiences here in Canada and growing up, is the audience in the West a big consideration for you? Like, is it important for you to bring these stories back to the West so there's a better understanding here of what happens where you're originally from?
Definitely. And I think there's a really receptive audience. Like, I mean, the reception the film has had all around the world has been incredibly positive. But I also think it's important to tell these stories to people in the Middle East as well. And Speed Sisters, it's one of the things that I'm quite proud of with the film is that it speaks to both audiences. People in the Middle East have embraced it to the same degree that people in the West have. So I think it's an unexpected universal story, and I think people just react to that.
That's a difficult thing to do, to make a film for two very different audiences. Are there specific people you keep in mind when you're crafting the story to make sure, will this translate for X and also for Y?
Definitely. We had a lot of Palestinians who worked on this film with us, and that was really our guide. Our editor, Rabab Haj Yahya, is Palestinian, and she was like sort of the key to the whole thing. I had such amazing access, and it was like such a great filming experience. But it was really Rabab that helped us craft that story in a way that I think really spoke. She brought out a lot of the nuance and a lot of the humor, and it really spoke to an Arab audience as well. So we had a lot of other Palestinians that were working on us. I think that was really key for us.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.